Hi guys, in this video we're going to be looking at the strings of the blues legends. First off, let's check out the best string bender of them all, Mr. Albert King. There's a bit of conjecture as to what exactly was Albert King's tuning throughout his career. But based on Hal Leonard's tab book, The Very Best of Albert King, they present Albert's tuning as follows: D, G, D, G, B, E, down 1.5 steps, which gives B, E, B, E, G sharp and C sharp. Albert actually preferred thin gauge strings, especially in the treble, and according to Duane Allman, his longtime guitar tech and the maker of his famous Lucy Flying V guitar, he used a 9 to 50 set. So bear in mind, when he was detuning to CFC FAD, the strings would have been quite slack. Okay, next up, let's look at Chicago bluesman's Buddy Guy's guitar strings. Buddy was using very thin strings in the early days. In fact, he used 8s on his E string. Nowadays, he's using Ernie Ball 2220 power slinkies, and they are 11, 14, 18, 28, 38 and 48. Okay, next up is the legendary B.B. King. Throughout his career, B.B. was known for using light gauge guitar strings. This set him apart from many other guitarists at the time who preferred heavier strings. B.B. King's string gauge typically consisted of 10, 13, 17, 26, 36 and 46. This lighter gauge obviously allowed him to perform his signature bends and vibrato with greater ease. Many players only wrap the string 2 or 3 times around the pole of the tuner. B.B. King liked to wrap the whole entire string around it, and this was because when he was younger, if he did break a string near the bridge, he could tie on the ball end and reuse the string. Gibson released a B.B. King signature electric guitar set, and these featured the gauge 10, 13, 17, 32, 45 and 54 on the E string. Our next guitarist is a Texas Cannonball, otherwise known as Freddie King. Freddie's top 3 string gauges were 10, 11 and 12, and this was very light for a B and a G string especially. The wound strings were the normal light to medium gauge. It's not really known why Freddie chose these particular string gauges, but it's probably the playability of the B and the G string that drew him to the lighter gauge strings. So from this we can surmise that his entire string gauge was 10, 11, 12, 26, 36 and 48. He also used a plastic pick on his thumb and a metal pick on his index finger. Okay, next up we have Roy Buchanan. Roy typically maxed the volume and tone controls on his amp, added reverb to taste and controlled everything from his guitar. He wore his telly high and used light gauge Fender rock and roll strings. And to quote Roy, he would only change them when they break. Fender rock and roll strings, otherwise known as 150, were in the catalogues from 1953 until 1979, and the set included the following strings: a 10, a 13, 15, 26, a 32 and a 38. Roy Buchanan's preferred set was 9, 12, 16, 26, 36 and 46. Okay guys, let's look at Otis Rush's gauge of guitar strings. When he was asked about his gear, Otis Rush says, "Well, there's 2 guitars I really like, my Gibson semi-hollows and Fender Strats. I can go with the Gibson 345 or 355, but any of the semi-hollows do it for me. Actually, with either heavy strings or sometimes lighter ones, like a 10 to 46 set. But like with anything, there's always something else out there. And for me, well, the Strats just can do some things and feel a bit differently than the Gibsons, and sometimes I'll trade off." The famous guitar luthier Duane Allman said of Otis Rush, "I saw Otis Rush play a lot in the 60s. He was using Gibson E340L light gauge. They were 11 to 52 with a wound G at 19. I'm sure he doesn't use them today since light strings were still pretty new. The first light strings I used were banjo strings for the top, and that was because I heard through the grapevine that James Burton did that, and that was what made that special sound. Later I realised that it was far more than the strings. Soon after the first light gauge electric guitar strings were introduced by Fender, they were called Fender 150 light gauge rock and roll. They still make them. Later Guild came out with Sidewinders. Then all hell broke loose in the string supply business." Okay guys, let's look at the main man, Muddy Waters. Although Muddy Waters had played several different models of guitar, The guitar which would become most associated with him was a 1957 Fender Telecaster. He bought it brand new in 1957 and took it with him to the Newport Jazz Festival and Europe tour, and it remained his favourite throughout the rest of his life, naming it the Hoss. The neck was replaced with a 1961 rosewood one, and the body was painted red. Muddy used Gibson medium gauge strings, and he used 12 to 56, with a plain 22 for the G string to replace the wound one. Next up is Johnny Winter. Johnny Winter says of his string gauge, "Firebirds, I love Firebirds. I like real high action. I had it pretty high before I played slide, because I played hard. Just for pushing strings, it's important for it to be high. When I have low action, I can't get my finger under the string to push it as well." The string gauges are 9, 11, 16, 24, 32 and 42, and the brand doesn't matter. Okay guys, let's move to the great blues guitarist Ronnie Earl. In 2013, in an interview in Premier Guitar magazine, Ronnie was using 10 gauge strings and medium picks. By 2013, he now had switched to Ernie Ball Super Slinky 9 to 42 or Diodario EXL 120, which were 9 to 42 strings. And his picks were still the Fender 351 medium celluloid. To quote Ronnie in a recent interview, "I've always used super reverb amps, and I'm going to be playing Duke amps. And I've been playing Nash guitars because I get nervous about taking the old ones out. I use whatever guitar is clean and the strings aren't rusted, and I buy whatever strings are on sale." The late great blues guitarist Michael Bloomfield used 9 gauge strings. To quote his guitar tech, he says, "My relationship with Michael started when my fetching him new E strings, straps and chords from my own guitar case when he broke stuff. I read books about philosophy, history and weird religions, so he let me hang out. Eventually I got the job, lessons for a roadie in training. He actually used Super Slinkies. I know because I kept his strings, and Fender extra heavy picks. The tobacco coloured Les Paul burst was lost shortly after I started." The Ernie Ball Super Slinky set came with 9, 11, 16, 24, 32 and 42. Now let's check out Rory Gallagher's strings. Rory used Fender Rock and Roll 150 strings. The gauge ran as follows: 10, 13, 15, 26, 32 and 38 on the low E string. Rory used a Telecaster for his slide playing, and on this guitar he used a custom gauge of his own creation, which was as follows: 13, 15, 18, 26, 32 and 38 on the low E. So whilst it was heavier on the treble strings, it was actually lighter on the bass strings. Rory said that he wasn't completely satisfied with the standard set and would sometimes change the bottom 2 or the top 2 ones, even on guitars that weren't used for slide. To quote him in 1977, he says, "Well, I use a mixture of Fender rock and rolls. The first is a 13 and the second is a 15, and I would buy a wound 20 string for the third, but I found it was best to stick to unwounds for tuning, so I used an 18 for the third. Then the fourth is a standard fourth, as is the fifth and the sixth. I'd put heavier on if I was tuning down, but I generally tune the telly to A or E and use a capo, whereas if I was playing in D like Raikuda does a lot, I use acoustic. D is a bit low on electric sometimes. I could always get another guitar and have it tuned down, whereupon you would need heavier strings." Duane Allman also used the Fender 150 guitar gauge string set, and these ran from 10, 13, 15, 26, 36 and 38. He also used these on his slide guitar. Bear in mind that when you tune to open E, you're tuning the A, D and G strings up. Duane liked to leave the strings uncut and curl them up at the tuning pegs. Proof of this can be seen in many photos. Okay, next up is Albert Collins, the Iceman. And Dan Erlewin in the Guitar Player's Repair Guide stated that Albert Collins used Fender 10 to 38s on his telly. Although interestingly, when Dan measured them with a caliper, each string was a gauge lighter than it was supposed to be. So in actual fact, it was more like a 9 to a 38 string gauge. And now to the great blues man, Robert Cray. He uses Diodario strings, and it's a fairly heavy gauge, 11, 13, 18, 28, 36 and 46. He plays with extra heavy Tortex picks, and he occasionally reaches in with his third or fourth finger to pull at the strings, just like Albert Collins. Robert shakes the strings pretty nicely with a natural vibrato he's developed. He says, I worked that out a long time ago from listening to BB King stuff. And also, I used to play with real heavy strings like a 13 on the high E. I didn't know they made lighter strings for the longest time, so I just kept on struggling with those heavies. Now, if I ever pick up a guitar with light gauge strings and really let loose on a 9, it goes right off the neck. Okay, last but not least is Stevie Ray Vaughan, and according to Stevie's tech, Rennie Martinez, he often played GHS nickel rockers and sometimes boomers in the following gauge: 13, 15, 19, plain, 28, 38 to 58 on the low E string. When his fingers were hurting, he then cut back to a 11 on the high E. Bear in mind that Stevie was also down tuning to E flat, so bear in mind the strings would have been a bit slacker than if he was in standard tuning. What's interesting about the string gauge is whilst the 13, 15 and 19 are quite a lot bigger than normal, the 28 and 38 on the D and the A string are quite light, especially when down tuning to E flat. So that means you can really vibrate and bend those two strings more than you would normally. And the 58 on the low E is really great for those kind of bass lines, putting your thumb over the neck and playing an A7 chord or an A13 chord, for example. Thanks everyone so much for watching this video. I'm going to be back soon, very soon in fact, with some more videos. Till then, take care. This is Goose signing out.